you, Dan. And good morning, everyone, and welcome to the TeTra seminar. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Karolina Tomczyszyn. Karolina is a doctoral researcher at KU Leuven in Belgium. She studied history in Warsaw and late antique and Byzantine studies in Oxford. She is interested in the cult of saints and in epigraphy, on which she has published in forthcoming articles. But her current research focuses on epistolography, in particular, the institutionalization of the Syriac Orthodox Church as seen through letters by Syriac scholars in the 7th and 8th centuries. And today, Karolina is going to share part of her ongoing work with us on literary curation in the correspondence of Jacob of Edessa, George, Bishop of the Arabs, and John of Litarb. Karolina, we really look forward to hearing from you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marion. Thank you so much to the TeTra organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share my research with you. And now I will try to share my screen. Okay, please tell me if it's working.
If you could just move to presenter mode.
Yes.
Perfect. Excellent.
Yes, it's working. Okay, great. Okay, so today I will be speaking about a special interest in literary curation, as attested in the correspondence of Jacob of Edessa, George, Bishop of the Arabs, and John of Litarb. And since this topic is part of my PhD project, as Marion mentioned, I will first give you an idea of how it fits into my PhD, and then briefly present the corpus of letters itself. And finally, I will zoom in on literary curation and discuss the ways in which it was expressed in the letters. So in my doctoral project, I researched the Syriac Orthodox Church at the turn of the 8th century through the lens of the correspondence of three authors from this period. The main focus of my project is therefore letters, a genre under-researched in the field of Syriac studies as compared to Latin and Greek scholarship on epistolography. In the first step of the project, I have transcribed and translated the unpublished letters of Jacob and John, and at the same time conducted a textual analysis of the letters' features, from greetings, salutations, titles of address, to correspondence, topics, places, and forms of the letters. These findings will serve as a foundation for further research on the development of the epistolary genre in Syriac, I hope. In the next step, my project aims to track the ongoing institutionalization of the Syriac Orthodox Church, since it was in the 7th and 8th centuries that the Church solidified its structures and codified its doctrines. I'm especially interested in how the earlier heritage of the Church was received by the three epistolographers, and what the letters can tell us about the efforts of the Church to secure its place in the changing society of the 8th century. In the last part of my project, the part on languages, I will explore to what extent the use of Syriac and Greek was a means of expressing and solidifying ecclesiastical identity. But before getting to the literary curation, I should also say a few words about the authors whose letters I'm researching. Jacob of Edessa, George, Bishop of the Arabs, and John of Litarb belonged to the circle of Miaphysite scholars linked to the monastery of Keneshre, circled in red on the map. This monastery was the most important center of Greek studies in the Miaphysite world and produced many church leaders, translators, and scholars, including Jacob, George, and probably also John. Despite the geographical distance, the three churchmen stayed in touch with each other thanks to their correspondence. Jacob of Edessa was a leading figure of the Syriac Orthodox Church at the turn of the 8th century. His vast knowledge, translating skills, and ability to write on subjects as diverse as canon law, Syriac grammar, and biblical commentaries made him a reference point for other members of his church, who, when in doubt, would write letters to him. While many of Jacob's literary works have been thoroughly examined, his 48 letters remain largely unpublished and under-researched. Most of his letters, 27 out of 48, have been preserved in 2 letter collections in the manuscript British Library Additional 12172. Some of you might have noticed that I have not put the number of Jacob's letters at 51, as in the list published by Jan van Ginkel in his article from 2008, instead giving the number 48. And of course, I'm happy to discuss my reasons for this later. The second scholar, George, Bishop of the Arabs, became a focal point for Syriac Orthodox intellectuals after Jacob's death. George finished Jacob's Hexameron and was a translator of Aristotle's works, such as the Categories. Alongside several theological texts, George left behind an important epistolary corpus from the years 714 to 718, of which 11 letters have been preserved, and they are currently being edited and translated by Jack Tanus. The letters have been preserved in a single manuscript, British Library Additional 12154. We know the least about the third figure, John the Stylite, who came from Litarb near Aleppo. He was a friend of both Jacob and George, and perhaps even their student. John was probably the author of a chronographical work that survives in a limited number of quotations. Only 1 letter of John has survived, and it was recently published by James Coakley. It has been preserved in the same manuscript as George's letters, immediately following George's letter collection. This rounds out the corpus of these 3 intellectuals at 60 letters. These letters are a fascinating set of texts, covering a wide range of subjects, from Syriac orthography and daily interactions between Christian and Muslims, to how to deal with so-called night temptations, for example. What was striking to me, though, was the number of references made to the earlier Miaphysite literary heritage, which is what I will explore in the rest of my presentation. Here is one of Jacob's list of approved teachers, as referenced in the title of my talk. So the authors who were perceived as orthodox in the correspondence. In Syriac, the words are malphone bhire, which you can see here. I hope you can see my mouse. And they were actually the most frequently used for those authors. This list comes from Jacob's letter 10 to John of Litarb, where Jacob lists the teachers whose work he should ideally consult to answer John's questions, though he doesn't currently have access to his books, so he unfortunately cannot consult them. Among those approved teachers are Athanasius of Alexandria, Basil of Caesarea, the 2 Gregories, so Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus. And actually, in some publications, it was assumed that there was only 1 Gregory on the list, that is Gregory of Nyssa, but I believe there is a Seyomer right here, so I would assume there are 2 Gregories on the list. Then we have John Chrysostom, Cyril of Alexandria, Severus of Antioch, and after a punctuation sign right here, we have Syriac authors, so Ephrem, Philoxenus of Mabuk, and Jacob of Serug. So it seems that the Greek and Syriac authors were visibly separated in the manuscript with a punctuation mark. Now, this is only a fraction of the authors mentioned in the correspondence, but already gives us an idea of who made it to the list, so who was important. And let's now see how those earlier authors and their works were received and related to in the correspondence. Given that Jacob, George, and John, as well as other scholars with links to Keneshre, were engaged in various scholarly activities, their interest in literary curation is not surprising. These activities included, for example, writing about earlier Miaphysite figures, commenting on works regarded as important, organizing works produced by earlier Miaphysites, and translating and retranslating the works of church fathers. I mentioned all of this to say that the process of canon formation, of which we have traces in the letters, did not happen in a vacuum, but was complementary to other scholarly activities of people connected to Keneshre. Nevertheless, I would argue that letters in particular offer a fascinating insight into the practicalities of establishing a canon of works and authors considered orthodox. All in all, I have identified 4 tangible practices which attest to Jacob, George, and John's interest in literary curation. The first practice is attributing works. In the letters, there are several instances in which the three scholars asked who these works were by, and sought to investigate their attribution, with works sometimes spuriously assigned to famous Miaphysite authors or having an unknown provenance. The second practice is identifying the authors, that is, researching who they actually were. This practice attests to the interest in earlier authors' biographies, their orthodoxy level, and even the meaning of their nicknames. The third practice is interpreting difficult passages. In the letters, there are many instances where correspondents say that they have a problem with a certain passage coming from a well-known author, such as Ephraim, and it really seems that Ephraim's works were a bit problematic for these authors. And those correspondents ask for the interpretation of a certain passage. The fourth practice is compiling the fathers. In my corpus, there's only one letter by John, which is basically a selection of excerpts from various authors, resembling the form of a florilegium, I would say. And these four practices, I believe, show that the three epistolographers were engaged in the process of curating the literary heritage of their church. I will now give an example of each of these four practices. Let's start with the attribution of works. In one of the letters, Jacob helps John with two very confusing homilies. Some people attributed these homilies to one of the most important 6th century Miaphysite figures, Jacob of Serug, whose earliest known depiction from a 12th century manuscript you can see on the screen. He was a bishop of Batnan and author of various verse and prose homilies, as well as letters and lives of holy men. Jacob of Edessa agreed with John that the attribution must be spurious. I quote, "Know that these homilies, which were written and attributed to the teacher Mar Jacob of Serug, are not by Mar Jacob, nor by the Spirit that was speaking through him and through all the teachers of the church. Jacob of Edessa learned from Jacob of Serug and decided about them that they are not by Jacob of Serug, neither by Ephraim, his teacher, nor by one of the sound men who have the mind of Christ. But these homilies are by an insignificant rhetorician, a one-day sage, who wanted to distinguish himself and place himself among the writers." The rest of the letter contains a thorough examination of the matter. It gives us an insight into Jacob of Edessa's methods of verification, through which he was able to decide whether the homilies were indeed written by Jacob of Serug or not. The first decisive factor was the meter in which the homilies were written, and the second was their content. The difference in meter was easy to spot. Jacob of Serug's homilies were written in only one 12-syllable meter, and Pseudo-Jacob wrote his homilies in two different meters. As for the content, the homilies contained certain heretical views about the 6 days of creation, which did not agree with the book of Genesis or other approved teachers according to Jacob of Edessa. Therefore, it seems the spurious homilies were perhaps an unsuccessful attempt to imitate Jacob of Serug's Hexameron. To ensure that other people will recognize the heretical homilies, Jacob of Edessa provided their incipits in his letter and encouraged John to inform him about any similar problems he might encounter in the future, so that other people may also learn from them. The pejorative language visible in the passage, calling someone an insignificant rhetorician is after all a bit insulting, is similar in the rest of the letter. At some point, Jacob of Edessa claims that the insignificant rhetorician took inspiration from the words of drunkards, women, people who sit in the vestibules, and people who talk nonsense. Then he mixed them with the words of Jacob of Serug, perhaps trying to enhance their credibility and ensure their survival. Moreover, the spirit-inspired breathing of the approved teachers, as you can see in the quote on the screen, which is actually a recurrent characteristic of the approved teachers in the letters, is contrasted with a highly imaginative metaphor of Pseudo-Jacob of Serug as a person breathing and smearing phlegm on Jacob of Serug's homilies. This pejorative treatment is similar to the portrayal of Afrahat in George's letters, but I do not have time to expand on this now. In fact, the discussion of the attribution of the homilies constitutes an example of quality control, an act of not allowing certain works, deemed unorthodox, to enter a carefully curated literary canon. By verifying the contents and the meter of the homilies, as well as by comparing them with other texts, Jacob wanted to preserve doctrinal orthodoxy. And I believe this constitutes an example of canon curation in action. The second practice, investigating the identity of the authors, is perhaps best reflected in the case of the three Isaacs of Antioch. Now, this question belongs to letter 14 from Jacob to John, in which Jacob discusses quite a few problems related to literary curation, among them the hymns by Simeon the Potter, which again I do not have time to discuss now. In the same letter, Jacob also explains the confusion regarding the three authors known under the same name, Isaac of Antioch. I quote, "Next, your fraternity asked about the teacher, Mar Isaac, namely whether there is one only, or two, or three, and also where they were from. And I replied to you also about that, with what I received from older men who preceded me. 3 men were authors in this language of Syrians, that is Arameans, who were called by this name Isaac. 2 were faithful, that is Miaphysite, and 1 was a Chalcedonian heretic." Unlike in the example of Pseudo-Jacob of Saruk's homilies, Jacob did not discuss the factors that allowed him to differentiate between the 3 Isaacs. Instead, he provided vast biographical information about all 3 Isaacs and the historical circumstances in which they lived, grouping them chronologically. According to Jacob, the first Isaac, Isaac of Amida, traveled to Rome, led a monastic life in Constantinople, and was imprisoned there, later returning to Amida. In the letter, he is situated in time with the mention of Ephraim, who was his teacher. The second Isaac, Isaac of Antioch, was presented in light of the origin story of his so-called parrot homily criticizing the Chalcedonians. His life was situated in time according to another Miaphysite figure, Peter the Fuller, Patriarch of Antioch. We learn from the letter that the third Isaac, Isaac of Edessa, was once a Miaphysite but became a Chalcedonian when the religious atmosphere in the city changed. Yet another Miaphysite figure, Bishop Paul of Edessa, is used to situate this Isaac in time. As recently argued by Adam Becker, it now seems that there were actually 4 Isaacs. Nevertheless, this confusion only shows that the matters that Jacob, George, and John were discussing back then are still quite problematic for scholarship, even nowadays. Jacob's decision to differentiate between the 3 Isaacs, 2 good, so Miaphysite, and 1 bad Chalcedonian, seems to have been a conscious decision in creating the Miaphysite literary tradition and in withstanding the opportunity to simplify that tradition by assigning all the works to 1 Isaac. At the same time, it was an important act of assessing the level of authors' orthodoxy. At the end of the day, one of the Isaacs was a Chalcedonian. Moreover, the fact that the 3 Isaacs and other people mentioned in this really long letter 14 are situated in time according to important Miaphysite figures makes it almost a Miaphysite era of measuring time, also an important identity-building factor. Interestingly, letter 14 also answers the question of nicknames of 2 Miaphysite figures. Already mentioned Peter the Fuller, Patriarch of Antioch, and Timothy A. Lurus, Patriarch of Alexandria, which I'm also happy to discuss later. It seems that the discussion of the nicknames was another means to ensure that the earlier Miaphysite heritage, of which memory perhaps started to fade, would be preserved in the collective memory of the Church. The third practice, interpreting difficult passages, is where curation of contemporaneous literary heritage appears on the scene. In one of the letters, at the request of John of Litarb, George explains some of the difficult passages from Jacob's letters, thus making him an approved teacher in the sense that his words were interpreted alongside those of important authors, such as Ephraim or Gregory of Nazianzus. The letter with George's explanations is dated in the manuscript to the year 715, so 7 years after Jacob's death. The 7 passages that appear in the letter from George to John actually come from Jacob's memorandum to Thomas the Stonecutter and letter to Kerisuna of Dara, who is probably identical with Eustachius of Dara, as argued recently by Paul Uleschin in his article. The fact that John had access to a letter by Jacob not addressed to him would suggest that the letter circulated among a wider audience. Here, I will show you 4 of those problematic passages pertaining to classical culture. John asks George, I quote, "What is this passage where he, that is Jacob, says, 'A person well known for his culture in the city was telling a story of a monkey, decked out in human clothes and feigning the behaviors of a human?' What is this next thing he states? The story is told among jocular men that though they heard the voice of a human, they found a small blind dog shut up in a chest." Again, what is this passage where he says, "Why do you bring an owl, a worthless night bird, to Athens?" Again, what is this which he says, "Why did Xanthus have need of the ugly Aesop, a stutterer, one who terrified children?" These sentences written by Jacob and references used by him are indeed quite different compared to what he would usually write. However, they make sense in the context of his correspondent, Kerisuna or Eustachius of Dara. Kerisuna was most probably a nobleman whose common ground with Jacob was their love for the Greek language and culture. While writing to him, Jacob would often code switch from Syriac to Greek, for example by including many wordplays between the 2 languages, and would also scatter some references to classical culture instead of just quoting the church fathers. John, however, did not understand these references, and so asked George for help. George, on the other hand, looked for answers in the works of the approved teachers. As such, the explanation of the story of the monkey was found by George in the letter of Gregory of Nyssa to Harmonius, but originally comes from Lucian of Samosata's The Fisher. I could not trace back the story about the blind dog, so if you have any idea, I would be grateful. The next story, about bringing an owl to Athens, can be found in the work of Severus of Antioch, another founding figure of the church from the 6th century, but has an earlier classical origin. It was discussed in the Second Sophistic period by Diogenes Laertius and Lucian of Samosata. As for the Aesop reference, the Aesop tales were transmitted in the Syriac tradition, but John did not seem to have been aware of that. All in all, as you can see, these references could be traced back to classical authors, but were mediated via the church fathers, and it does not seem that there was a high awareness of their original classical context. However, perhaps it could be argued that Jacob was actually aware of their original context. Given that Lucian of Samosata's mother tongue was probably Syriac, perhaps Jacob was playing with that fact by alluding to his works. We know that some of Lucian's works were actually translated into Syriac and transmitted within anthologies of ascetic literature. It's an unsubstantiated claim right now, but I just wanted to put it out there. The fact that John asked George to explain passages from Jacob's letter to Kerisuna shows that Jacob's letters were in circulation as early as the year 715, since George's reply is dated to that year in the manuscript. The mention of Jacob's letters would suggest that his letters were perhaps meant not only to reach their addressees, but others too. Nevertheless, the process of discussing and circulating Jacob's letters can be seen as part of literary curation, and shows that there was conscious effort, either on Jacob's part or someone else's, to preserve his works and to claim a position of authority for the new Miaphysites. The fourth practice, compiling the fathers, is evidenced only in one letter, the letter of John of Litarb, addressed to Daniel the Arab priest. John of Litarb replies to Daniel's question about the biblical prophecy of Jacob from the book of Genesis, also linking it with the prophecy of Daniel. While doing so, John refrains from giving his own opinions, limiting himself to merely providing a list of excerpts from various authors. Among the authors mentioned by him are John Chrysostom, Pseudo-Cyril of Alexandria, Hippolytus, Ephrem, Severus Sebocht, Jacob of Edessa, and George, Bishop of the Arabs. He also mentions two chroniclers in his letter, that is Eusebius and Andronicus. This compilation of excerpts makes the letter a sort of florilegium with passages pertaining to these two biblical prophecies at hand. John basically says that he will say nothing of his own, but will merely provide a set of quotations from other authors who have already spoken on the matter. 3 out of 7 authors used by John are contemporaneous Syriac authors with links to the monastery of Keneshre. Among them is Severus Sebocht, a mid-7th century scholar working on astronomy, philosophy, and mathematics. He was also writing letters and was probably a teacher of Jacob of Edessa. John also included interpretations of the prophecy taken from the letters of his friends, Jacob and George. In the case of Jacob, John is not very precise regarding his source, saying, "The next, also the Venerable Mar Jacob, Bishop of Edessa, the great philosopher of our days, wrote somewhere in one of his letters to someone." The identity of Jacob's addressee is actually known to us. John is simply referring here to himself, probably not revealing his name out of modesty, since similar mentions of the prophecy of Daniel appear in Jacob's letter 6 addressed to him. While referring to George's letter, John says, "Then the Venerable Mar George, our common father and your bishop, also wrote in response to the 10th question to Jacob, priest, and his Syncellus." The fact that John uses information coming from Jacob and George's letters shows that he had access to them, which is not surprising since he was the addressee of Jacob's letter on the prophecy. However, the fact that John also had access to the letter addressed to George's Syncellus again shows that the distribution of letters was curated, either by their authors or by other people engaged in the process. The inclusion of the new Miaphysites in the letter, all connected to Keneshre, so Severus Sebocht, Jacob of Edessa, and George, Bishop of the Arabs, shows that Miaphysite scholarly circles were actively engaged in the process of adding new authors to the canon and asserting their own authority. This inclusion, in turn, shows the importance of the monastery of Keneshre in creating and developing a Miaphysite literary canon during the course of the 7th and 8th centuries. I have argued that the letters of Jacob, George, and John offer insight into the making of the literary canon in practice, namely how, on a daily basis, Miaphysite scholars approached their own literary heritage and identified those whom they considered worthy of being called approved teachers. I have discussed several practices through which Jacob, George, and John managed their literary canon and performed quality control over it. These practices included attributing the works, identifying the authors, interpreting problematic passages, and compiling excerpts from certain Syriac and Greek authors. As we have seen in several examples, the 3 epistolographers were not only passive recipients of a received literary canon, but were also consciously creating it. They were doing so by assessing the orthodoxy of works and authors, preserving memory about earlier authors, and adding new authors, all connected to the monastery of Keneshre, to the literary canon. Since Jacob, George, and John were probably aware that their correspondence was reaching a wider audience and not just their addressees, or perhaps were even involved in curating their own epistolary collections, their letters can also be seen as a conscious literary product, in which they were self-fashioning themselves and their literary heritage. Literary curation, as I have argued, can therefore be seen as one of the elements involved in the process of the institutionalization of the Syriac Orthodox Church. I would also be grateful if you have any similar cases in your own research areas about the process of creation literary canons to share them with me during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karolina. That was wonderful. There's now time for questions. I would suggest we have quite a big group of people. So if you have a question, if you can't speak, you can write it in the chat, and otherwise raise a digital hand it's in the React section in the bottom of the screen. So maybe I can start, which is already, I have a question in relation to, well, several questions, but the major one is in relation to sort of the issue of canon and impact, wider impact of this material, because we don't have that many manuscripts. So that in itself suggests that sort of the impact was maybe more limited than it actually appears to be. How should I put it? Is it more like, is it a circle of people and then they have their connections and that material is preserved in connection to Kenishhe? But then, well, are there any other manuscripts? And this one, is there sort of any evidence of use in later periods? Maybe let's maybe start with this question. Thanks.
You mean that we sort of have this one manuscript that preserves most of Jacob's letters, and what can it tell us about the further impact? Yes, that's what I was also asking myself. Yeah, also the context of the whole manuscript is a bit cryptic to me. It seems that the whole manuscript is a composite manuscript. So it was just, several other works were just sort of put together. So we cannot really say much about like the context of the preservation of those letters that much. Yeah, it seems that these letters weren't really copied afterwards. There are several later manuscripts copied up until the 19th century, I would say, which preserve other letters of Jacob. The most popular were the letter on the Syriac orthography, preserved in several manuscripts, and also the letter attributed to Jacob, the so-called letter on the divine economy, which is a bit problematic as you know. Probably containing some parts that were written by Jacob, but then edited, and many things were added to this letter, let's put it that way. So these letters were quite popular, but I would say that some rules or canons preserved in the manuscript British Library Additional 12172 also passed on, but not as letters, but in excerpts. I believe that in Bar Hebreus Nomo Canon we can find some of these bits that can be originally found in this one manuscript. But as you said, it doesn't seem that the letter collection was copied in its entirety. I think it was more of a process of selecting certain important bits that were perhaps circulated afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then I have one more question. I was wondering if you could go back to the slide where it's the letter 1 by Jacob on the homilies of Jacob being genuine or not. I was just curious. I read something that's just going to be easier if we just look at it again.
So this one, yeah.
Yes, because I saw, so it says Jacob of Edessa learned from Jacob and decided about them. But then it's a letter by Jacob to John, but it's quoting him in the third person. So it's rewritten then?
Yeah, this passage is curious. Yeah, actually, I haven't really noticed that. Thank you, because why would he say about why would he talk about himself in the third person? Yeah, usually he just says I decide, I say. Maybe he was trying to play with the names by repeating the same name, Jacob. I don't know.
Yeah.
He was sometimes trying to play with certain words. Maybe this was just one of the techniques that he was trying to.
Okay, but it's not elsewhere in the same letter where it's third person. It's just in this case.
No,
So
just in
someone
this,
just changed it.
just in this passage. Yes.
Okay. Okay, I was curious about this.
No,
Okay.
thank you. I will look more into that actually.
And then one more note, and then I will pass on the word to Alison. You mentioned this reference to the Gregories in the plural. It might be 3, not 2, because it's Gregory the Wonder Worker, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzen. Because George of the Arab tribes has a letter to Yeshu where he talks about the three Gregories when he's trying to distinguish them from Gregory the Illuminator. So I'm pretty sure it's going to be three, not two.
So I
that's
think it's three. Okay, yeah.
Likely that they know all three, and that they're also considered all to be Orthodox teachers. So that was
Yeah, I mean, I just based it on the fact that Jacob doesn't seem to mention Gregory Thaumaturgus that much in his letters, so that's why I thought he meant only Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus. Yeah, Gregory Thaumaturgus is mentioned, I believe, only in George's letters.
okay.
But I would have to check that. But yes, thank you so much for that.
Yeah. That's interesting itself. Thanks very much. All right, Alison.
Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. I've learned so much from that. I'm currently working on a monograph on Jacob of Edessa. I mean, actually got research leave for this, and so I'm covering everything fairly superficially. And it's at the moment it's a monograph aimed mainly at the Syriac Orthodox community in the diaspora, but with notes for students and scholars right at the back, so they're not distracting for the general reader. So I've been working my way through some of the letters and so on. I thought this was a really interesting and illuminating perspective, which I really learned a lot from. I suppose going back to the letter on orthography, that I know it's not about theology as such, but it's very interesting. I think that he actually says in his letter, please get this letter copied and sent to everybody. Okay, it has a very practical dimension, but I think that's particularly interesting that it's really specified that is the aim of this letter, that it should be circulated. And it's also very ironic, of course, that there are lots of mistakes in the copying of the letter as we've got it now. So even in the 8th century, the scribes were copying a letter about bad copying by scribes badly. So that's a nice irony. And also you were talking about excerpting from letters. And of course, this is how we get the canonical collections from Jacob. These were letters written, parts of correspondence with people writing to him and asking him practical questions about how to deal with magic and superstition, or people converting to Islam or whatever in their own parishes, and what they should be doing about it. And as time goes on, those replies get shorter and shorter, and you often end up with no question. You only get Jacob's answer, so that the whole thing becomes really attenuated. But that all those canons originated apparently in letters, as far as we can tell.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I would like to explore it further, perhaps in terms of dealing with ecclesiastical legislation as evidence in the letters. I also thought that all these collections, like questions of Adai that he asked Mar Jacob, it also seems to me that they might have been letters that were sort of preserved in a shortened form, as you say. So yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating. I will be wanting to work on that further, perhaps.
I think particularly where you have the collections where Adai's question is, it just says metul and then it talks about the situation, but it's not actually in correspondence style. It does seem as if even at that stage, somebody has taken the effort to just kind of reduce the question to the bare essentials rather than the specificities of the situation. I don't think Adai would have just written metul and then the rest. I think it looks to me like an editorial hand has been working there. But
yes,
thank you. That was sorry.
Adapting to another genre. Yeah.
Yes, and also the fact that, of course, writing materials and scribal time is valuable, and you don't want to waste parchment in words that you don't need. This is an expensive business. And also going back to the idea of preservation, Jack Tanous recently, as some people here may have heard that paper about 2 or 3 weeks ago in Oxford, gave a very interesting paper where he just estimated how much literature has been lost in Syriac over the generations. And so if we don't have good preservation of letters, it's probably as much accidental damage and deliberate damage, I suppose, and deliberate destruction sometimes, whether within the church or outside. as a lack of interest.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
thank you very
so
much.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for your
No, I
comments.
really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, you mentioned at the very beginning also. Yes, you noted that you had for the corpus of Jacob, you had 48 instead of 51 letters, and then suggested you might want to say something about this. So now's your chance.
Yes. In the on the list produced by Jan van Ginkel for his article, there are several letters that are sort of duplicated, I would say. One of them, which is preserved in the manuscript British Library Oriental 2307, which Van Ginkel calls a letter on the history, I think, of the world, is in fact another witness to the letter on the divine economy, which I have sort of noticed just reading through the letter, because the titles are the titles are kind of similar, a bit different, but when you sort of read the text of the letter, it becomes obvious that it's another witness to the letter in the divine economy. And also yourself, Andy, you've noticed in one of your articles that another letter mentioned in Van Ginkel's list, preserved in one of the manuscripts from Berlin, it's just an ending of the letter, is also a witness to the letter of the letter on the divine economy. And then yet another subtracted letter comes from Paul Ulyszny's argument from his article on the correspondence of Jacob and Eustachius of Dara. Jan van Ginkel assumed that because George of the Arabs mentions the second letter of Kirisuna, and there is one letter to Kirisuna just at the end of this letter collection in the manuscript, and Jan van Ginkel assumed that this second letter was just lost, and we just have references to it in George's letter. But in fact, given that Eustachius and Kirisuna are actually the same person, the same references are mentioned in the second letter to Eustachius of Dara, which further reinforces the argument that they are actually the same person. So all these classical references that I mentioned also in my presentation, they come, yes, from the second letter to Kirisuna, but it's at the same time the second letter to Eustachius. So that's why it was sort of, this letter was mentioned twice in the list. So that's why it can also be subtracted, and that's how we arrive at the number 48.
Okay, Madalina.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. That was really excellent, and yeah, I'm very curious about all these letters and the idea of a collection and so on. So I have a question a bit in this line, because so you were mentioning that in the case of Jacob, we have the letter of on orthography, and of course that's a sort of a separate thing all together. And then we also have these excerpted letters, which, do they qualify as letters? Do they qualify as something else? So we do have a bit of a genre, if not shifting, but anyway, shifting in the process of these new Neaphthite collections and so on. So how can we, given these differences, how can we see, or can we see in any way, a process of creating a collection, some sort of an authorial intention behind it? Do we see any attempt of thinking along the lines of having a collection, a letter collection? What do we know in this? I know it's not a straightforward thing, but I'm really wondering, because you also mentioned about this self-fashioning thing, and you mentioned the memory of creating a collection. We do have the reference which was mentioned before about the letter on orthography being sort of wanted to be widespread as much as possible and so on. So how much can
Yes,
receive
thank you so
in
much for
this
this
language.
question. I'm sort of always on the lookout for those things when I'm reading the letters. And actually, we have, I think, one trace of that in this first letter of Jacob to John, which contains the story about the pseudo Jacob of Syriac homilies. Because Jacob mentions very much, like a lot in this letter, that John should really come forward to him with all these difficult passages or weird cases that he finds in his own research, and that this will be beneficial for other readers. And other people will not stumble, when they sort of look weird texts. And I think that it's significant that this letter opens the whole collection of those 17 letters. Perhaps I read it as an invitation to the reader to sort of, embark on this journey of discovering all these difficult passages, mysterious authors, with Jacob and George. So perhaps I would say that this is like an opening letter, an invitation to follow them on this journey. And another trace of perhaps how this collection was formed can be found, in my opinion, in the fact that out of those 17 letters in the second collection, 16 are addressed to John of Litarb, and only one is addressed to another person, to George the deacon. And this letter of George the deacon is sort of inserted in between letters to John of Litarb. And I think it was inserted because it contained an explanation of one of Ephraim's hymns, 25th hymn on the Nativity, which is actually hymn 21st in the modern edition. So there's a discrepancy in the numbers. And this letter to George the deacon is placed next to a letter to John of Litarb, in which Jacob explains another hymn by Ephraim, 44th hymn on faith. So I think someone, perhaps an editor, hard to say whether it was Jacob himself who had control over it, but someone certainly thought that these two letters should go together because they both contain an explanation of like problematic passages from Ephraim. So that's another piece that I can give you. Yeah, I will sort of continue looking for things like that, but I hope I answered your question.
Okay, Marion has the next question.
Thank you so much, Karolina. I really enjoyed all of this. I wondered if I could also get back to your first case study, where Jacob describes himself as Jacob learning from Jacob who learned from Ephraim. And I thought you hinted that Ephraim was sort of a complicated figure for them. And I was just curious, here Jacob seems to be placing himself in Ephraim's genealogy as sort of his intellectual grandson. So I wondered, does this play a role throughout the letters? Is this something that concerns them? Or are they actually more active when it comes to Greek authors and to Miaphysite authors of their own context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in one of the letters, Jacob compared himself to Jesus, sending a reply to King Abgar. So I think we have many cases like that. Yeah, but it's interesting that he sort of inserted himself in this sense. I feel like Jacob didn't place himself quite like that in any other place, but certainly John and George added him to the list of the approved teacher, as I tried to argue by explaining difficult passages from one of his letters, and also John by placing an excerpt from Jacob's letter in his letter to Daniel the Arab priest. So yeah, I don't think that Jacob explicitly did it again, like in the same way, but Jacob and George certainly.
Thank you.
I have another question to do with, you mentioned at the beginning also you've worked on greetings and salutations and so I was wondering if you could say something about this as well. I know it's not part of this talk, but I'm just curious. Is it sort of, well, I assume some you've been looking at it in relation also to Greek letter writing, I guess. But do you want to maybe say something about this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the most common it's also interesting how they were calling each other. I found it interesting. In reference to John of Litarb, he would usually call him achutoch, so like your fraternity, your brotherhood. But for example, in case of Eustachius of Dara, he would use Shapchutoch, so like your praiseworthiness. So perhaps there is a slight change between the sort of ecclesiastical and lay correspondence that he sort of uses different titles. And usually he calls himself Meskinuso, so like yeah, like humbleness, poverty. He tries to like diminish his own worth in that sense. And yeah, I mean the comparison with sort of the Greek side of things is what I'm planning to do in the future. So I haven't exactly done that yet. But yeah, that's one of the elements that I would like to research further. I mean, certainly there are some Greek influences in that. In the fact that they don't use Shlomo so much, like in terms of greetings. They usually use Mechdo, which can be traced to Greek Hyrein, I would say. So yeah, this was argued by Sebastian Brock and Jack Tanus that this is like basically a calque from Greek. And this was also used. This kind of greeting was also used by Timothy the First later in a different context of the Church of the East, which is also interesting in itself. Yeah, but that's something that I would like to go deeper into later.
Okay. And I have another question about so many things come up. In relation to sort of these networks of people. Do we have in these letters also comments about how these letters are delivered? Sort of the intermediaries, are these people a part of the network as well? Do we have mentions of people in the letters that are actually never an addressee? Those kind of things. I don't know if this has been part of your approach, but
Yes, there's. I can think of one letter. In fact, of letter to from Jacob to Eustachius of Dara, in which he basically uses a story of the biblical story of Gibeonites to say that they were sort of dressed in a different way and they pretended to come from a far away. And he writes about that story in the context of a letter carrier, of a letter, like delivering his letter from Eustachius to Jacob. That it's a very sort of weird big metaphor that he immediately recognized this letter carrier as being from Eustachius because he wasn't as deceiving and as sort of weirdly dressed as Gibeonites. So that's the one mention of a letter carrier that I can think of now, which is very elaborate actually.
interesting. Okay. If anyone has a pressing question, last chance. I'm looking around. No. Okay. Then thank you all for joining us, and let's all thank Karolina for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you all. See you next time.
Thank you, everyone.